I once begged in the middle of a storm, begged them to let me go just long enough to save my seizing son in the back seat. But they didn't. They cuffed me. One person live-streamed, another smirked, and my son, banging on the window, faded in silence. I thought I had only one option left: to die with him. But instead, I chose to survive. So I could come back and destroy every single one of them who laughed that night in the rain. If you think this is just another family drama, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now to witness stories that will shake you with the truth. The rain was coming down like judgment. Not a soft drizzle, not the kind that whispered against windows, but a relentless, pounding storm that clawed at the world like it wanted to peel it back. Marla Jensen stood in the kitchen barefoot on cold tile, heart hammering, holding a small white pill bottle in her hand. Empty. She turned it upside down again, hoping some miracle would drop out. Nothing. Not even dust. Her breath hitched. No. A sound behind her, soft but sharp, cut through the drumming storm. Eli's voice. "Mom!" She turned sharply. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen, swaying. His tiny fist clutched the side of the wall. His eyelids fluttered like paper in the wind. Then came the tremor. It always started in the fingers. Marla dropped the bottle. It clattered on the floor, echoing off the tile like a taunt. She rushed forward, catching him just as his knees gave out. His body jerked once in her arms, a soft groan escaping his throat as his muscles started to tighten. "Stay with me, baby," she whispered, brushing back the wet hair clinging to his forehead. His skin burned. He was overheating. Another seizure coming. She laid him on the floor, gently pulling the drawer open under the sink. That's where the emergency meds were: backup pills, the EpiPen, the dissolvable strips. The drawer was already open. No meds inside. She froze. The brown plastic case that always held the seizure strips was there. Open. Empty. Her hands shook. No one else had access. No one but her. No one but Gwen. Marla's teeth clenched. The neighbor from across the cul-de-sac. Always smiling. Always commenting about how Marla looked a little frazzled. Always stopping by uninvited, bringing cookies Marla never ate, and asking too many questions. Always touching things. She slammed the drawer shut, the sound cracking like a whip through the storm-beaten house. Eli twitched again on the floor. She needed to move. Now. She grabbed the keys from the counter and scooped him into her arms. He was getting heavier. 8 years old and fragile as wet paper. His breath came in short, uneven gasps against her collarbone. "I've got you, sweetheart," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "Mommy's got you." Outside, the wind hit her like a shove. Her shirt clung to her in seconds, soaked through. The porch light flickered above her head, pathetic, sputtering yellow-white. A useless witness. The world was a blur of gray and flashing shadows. The storm swallowed sound whole. She fumbled with the car door opening the back seat, laid him down gently, buckled him in hands, moving faster than her brain. The thunder cracked so hard it felt like the sky tore open. "Stay awake, Eli," she said, pressing her palm to his cheek. "We're going to the hospital." "Okay. Just stay with me a little longer." His eyes rolled slightly. The whites showed. No time. She slammed the door shut and raced around to the driver's side. Climbed in, shoved the key into the ignition. The dashboard lights blinked like they too weren't sure this was a good idea. The engine sputtered, then caught. Marla gripped the wheel, breath shuddering. Then she remembered. Her license. She'd let it expire. The real one. What she had now was provisional limited use, technically restricted, not valid under emergency conditions. Not that it mattered. No ambulance was coming in time. Not in this storm. Not with the gridlock the town was already under. No one else was going to save her child. She looked into the rear-view mirror. Eli's head had slumped slightly to the side. His lips were turning pale. The world narrowed down to one thought: drive. She yanked the gear shift into reverse and backed out of the driveway, tires skidding slightly on the wet concrete. Her headlights cut through the rain in broken white beams. The windshield wipers screeched across the glass, barely keeping up. As she turned onto the main road, a familiar shape appeared on the sidewalk, a silhouette under an umbrella standing too still. Gwen. Even through the darkness, even through the blur of rain and tears, Marla saw it. Gwen was smiling, not wide, just the corners of her lips curled upward, a knowing, satisfied curve. The kind of smile people have when they think they've won. Marla's stomach turned to ice, but she didn't stop, didn't yell, didn't scream. She drove past her, faster, tires slicing through puddles, the whole street a mirror of storm water and secrets. She gritted her teeth. "You're not getting away with this." The car rocked as wind slammed against its side. Her hands tightened on the wheel. She checked the rear view again. Eli was twitching. She hit the accelerator. Ahead, the road twisted through the hills that led toward St. Julian's General Hospital. Trees on either side whipped in the wind. Power lines swayed and sparked. A street sign had fallen over, spinning in circles like a compass gone mad. A small voice came from the back seat. "Mommy." She nearly slammed the brakes. "Eli." He blinked at her through hazy, half-lidded eyes. His voice was a whisper broken by tremors. "I'm cold." "I know, baby. Hold on." She reached back, fumbling for the emergency blanket she always kept stuffed behind the seat. Found it. Threw it over him without looking. He curled into it instinctively. Almost there, she lied. They weren't. The nearest hospital was 20 minutes away under normal conditions. In this storm, 30, 40, lightning flashed bright, searing, illuminating everything for a half-second. And that's when she saw it. Up ahead, a black Mercedes. Stopped in the middle of the road. Hazard lights blinking. She honked. No response. She slowed, heart racing. Rain pounded harder. The Mercedes door opened. A man stepped out. Tall, expensive coat, slicked back hair. He didn't wave, didn't move aside, just stood in the middle of the road holding a phone to his ear, looking mildly irritated. Marla swerved left, avoiding him by inches, and clipped the bumper. The sound was sharp, metal scraping, plastic cracking. She hit the brakes instinctively, car jerking, skidding sideways. The Mercedes driver spun on her, furious. She rolled down her window halfway. "I'm sorry. My son is sick. He needs help." "You hit my goddamn car," he shouted. "I didn't see, please, he's having a seizure." But he wasn't listening. He was dialing. Marla's stomach dropped. A second later, blue lights bloomed in her rearview mirror. And just like that, the night turned colder. Her child was dying in the back seat, and she was about to be treated like a criminal. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything would break and begin again. The storm wasn't letting up. It howled through the narrow roads like something feral, slamming wind and rain against Marla's windshield with such force that even the wipers screaming across the glass were losing the fight. Marla gripped the wheel tighter. Her knuckles were white. She leaned forward as if getting closer might help her see more than shadows and streaks of headlights. Each breath came jagged. Her eyes flicked between the road and the rearview mirror where Eli's head lolled to the side, half swallowed by the emergency blanket. "Just a little longer," she whispered to herself. "Just a little longer, baby." Visibility was down to nothing. The trees lining the road bowed under the wind, skeletal arms clawing at the car as it passed. Puddles had become miniature lakes, and the yellow lines on the road had long since disappeared under the current. She rounded a tight corner and, shit, she slammed the brakes too late. The car jolted as the front right bumper clipped something solid, unmoving low and wide. Her heart stopped. For a moment, time froze. Even the rain seemed to pause, suspended in disbelief. Then came the sound, a horrible screech of metal tearing across polished paint. The car rocked sideways, then jerked forward again, wheels spinning before regaining grip. Marla's breath caught in her throat. She hit the hazard lights. Hands trembling, she put the car in park and looked ahead. There, about 20 feet away, a black luxury sedan sat half-curbed under a broken street lamp. Its taillights blinked steadily. She recognized the emblem on the back instantly, a custom-plated S-Class Mercedes, the kind only 3 people in the entire county drove. And one of them, the driver's side door flung open. A man in a drenched trench coat stepped out, umbrella snapping backward in the wind, before he threw it aside in frustration. He stalked toward her car, his face pinched, pale, and unmistakable. Mayor Robert Glenn's. Of all the goddamn people. Marla fumbled to roll down her window halfway. "I'm so sorry," she called out over the rain, voice cracking. "My son, he's having a seizure. I didn't see your car, the rain, but Glenn's didn't hear any of it. Or maybe he just didn't care." "You hit my vehicle," he bellowed, his voice somehow slicing through the storm. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Marla blinked at him, stunned. "I didn't mean to," she managed. "Please, he's very sick. Look, he's in the back seat. I need to get him to the—" Glenn's hand went up, silencing her. "Don't play games," he snapped, stepping even closer. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, but the anger in his eyes burned hotter than the wind could cool. "You think this is cute? You clip a government official's vehicle and start crying your way out of it?" Marla flinched like he'd struck her, her jaw clenched. "I'm not crying my way out of anything. My son's having a medical emergency. If you'll just—" "I'm calling the police." The words hit her like ice water. She stared at him. "No, please don't." He was already dialing, pacing in front of his car, his voice sharp, authoritative, disgusted. Marla turned back toward the rear. Eli was groaning now, curled tighter, fists clenched. She looked down at her trembling hands on the steering wheel. The urge to drive off hit her like a wave, push the gas and go. Let the dent in his precious bumper be a problem for tomorrow. But it was too late. From the corner of her eye, she saw them. Phones. 2 pedestrians across the street, sheltering under an awning, were recording. Another car had pulled over. A woman inside held up her phone, zooming in through the window. And then the murmurs started. One of them pointed. The other laughed. "That's her," someone said. "That's the crazy chick from Maple Lane. I've seen her yell at the HOA before. Always drama." Another voice cut in. "Now she's trying to extort the mayor." Her stomach twisted. She reached for her window button, started rolling it back up. But too late. A man in a red poncho appeared on her side, filming directly into her car. His face was blank. Curious. The way people stare at roadkill. Marla turned her head away. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't real. A knock at the passenger window made her jump. She turned, expecting another civilian. Instead, blue. A flashlight beam cut through the glass. Rain trickled down the lens. The badge flashed behind the glare. Police. 2 officers now. One at her window. Another with a clipboard already out, speaking with Glenn's. Her chest locked. The officer tapped again. She rolled the window down halfway. "Ma'am." The voice was curt. "We received a call about a vehicular collision and possible attempted extortion. Step out of the vehicle, please." What her voice was barely audible. I said, "Step out of the vehicle." "My son," she said quickly, gesturing back. "He's sick. He's in the middle of a seizure. We need to get to the hospital." The officer's face didn't change. "We'll take care of it. But I need you to step out." Behind the officer, the man in the red poncho was still recording. Behind him, more cars were stopping. More phones were rising. A circus. She swallowed the taste of bile in her throat. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a scene. And she was the villain. The woman who caused a car wreck. The woman who used her child for attention. The one who never belonged in the neighborhood to begin with. She looked down at her lap, her hands. She thought of Gwen. That smile this morning. That smug, practiced grin. It was never about cookies. It was never about being neighborly. It was always about watching her fail. And now live on 6 phones, Marla was giving them the finale they'd waited for. She turned her head slightly, looked into the back seat. Eli's mouth was open, his eyes glassy, his chest rising in erratic pulses. And for a second she saw him years from now. Not in a hospital. Not even in a home. Just gone. Just a name she would scream into the dark when no one else was listening. No, she wasn't going to let them take this moment from her. She opened the car door, stood slowly in the downpour, her clothes clinging to her like skin. Her hair flattened across her face. The rain didn't stop. Neither did the recording, or the muttering, or the judgment. She raised her arms slightly as if surrendering not to the officer but to the storm itself. And in her mind one final sentence rang out clearer than thunder. They don't know who they're dealing with. The wind screamed like something unhinged. Rain slammed sideways against the asphalt, the sky above blackened as if the heavens themselves disapproved of everything unfolding below. Marla stood in the full violence of the storm-soaked, shivering breath hitching, but none of it compared to the cold hand clenching around her spine. "Ma'am, I said turn around," the officer repeated louder this time, his hand already on the steel cuffs at his belt. Marla's eyes widened. She took a step forward, palms raised. "No, wait! Please, he's in the back seat!" she cried, pointing desperately toward the car. "My son is having a seizure. He needs his EpiPen. It's in my jacket. Just let me, please." The officer didn't even glance where she was pointing. His expression remained impassive, almost bored, as if he'd heard it all before and none of it mattered anymore. Another phone screen lit up nearby, another bystander capturing her desperation, her hysteria, her breakdown. "Ma'am, stop resisting. I'm not," her voice cracked. "I'm begging." She turned, eyes flicking to Eli. He was thrashing now. The blanket had fallen. His limbs jerked in the way that never stopped haunting her. One arm pinned against the seatbelt, the other clenched into a fist so tight his knuckles had gone white. "Mommy." The sound tore through the car, muffled but unmistakable. Marla lunged toward the door handle but didn't make it. Two hands grabbed her from behind, rough. No warning. A twist, a shove. Her knees buckled slightly, but she stayed upright, too fueled by adrenaline to let gravity win. Then came the cold metal. Click, click. The handcuffs dug into her wrists. She gasped, not from pain but from humiliation, from helplessness, from the sheer absurdity of the moment. They were cuffing her, while her child was dying 20 inches away. The officer said something over his shoulder into the radio clipped to his vest, likely some procedural nonsense. "Suspect in custody." As if she were a criminal, not a mother. Marla turned, shoulders heaving. "You don't understand. He's not faking this. He needs that injection. He has epilepsy. He'll aspirate. He'll die." The officer ignored her, nudging her toward the back of the squad car. His boots splashed through the puddles, dragging her along like a nuisance, a noise to be removed from the scene. She twisted in his grip. "My EpiPen. It's in my jacket right pocket. Let me give it to him, please." Still nothing. Another man, a younger officer, stood by, idly watching, thumbs hooked into his vest, like a spectator at a show. Someone shouted from across the street. "Let the cops do their job. Another should have stayed off the road, lady." Laughter bubbled up over the wind. Laughter. It wrapped around her like thorns. She could barely see. Her wet hair clung to her cheeks. The rain was relentless now, flooding the streets, soaking through her jeans, her socks, her skin, her dignity. Inside the car, Eli's cries were becoming unintelligible. A guttural choking sound. A sound of air failing. A sound that used to pull nurses running. And now no one moved. Marla tried again, louder this time, voice ripping through her throat like glass. "He needs me." The older officer turned finally. "No one's dying in the back of a car, ma'am." His words came out flat, dismissive. As if they weren't talking about a child. As if it were just traffic. Marla looked at him, soaked to the bone, cuffs cutting her wrists raw. A woman unmade in the middle of the street. "You have no idea what you're doing," she whispered. "You're going to let him die." The man didn't respond. Instead, he opened the squad car door and shoved her in. The plastic seat was freezing. Water pooled beneath her. Her back hit the cold frame, spine aching. Through the window, all she could see was Eli's face. Pale, mouth open, eyes fluttering. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "Baby," she breathed. "Baby, I'm here." But he couldn't hear her now. Another flash of light. Not lightning this time, but a camera. A teenager on the sidewalk caught the exact moment Marla screamed through the glass. He smiled, satisfied. A notification sound chimed from his phone. "Upload complete." "Hey, it's already on Reddit," someone called out, laughing. Another psycho mom meltdown, and still the officers didn't move. No one opened the back door. No one checked Eli's pulse. No one cared. The tears came now, unbidden, useless. They mixed with the rain that soaked her face, making everything blur. Lights, shapes, reflections, even time. Marla slumped forward, resting her forehead against the window, whispering over and over, "Please, please, please." The wind picked up, slamming against the car like fists. A trash bin skidded across the street in the gusts, hitting the curb with a clatter. Marla raised her head slightly at the sound. Her eyes darted toward the road, and then she saw it. A low, dark shape emerging through the curtain of rain. Not police. Not a city vehicle. Black. Wide. Quiet. A Chevy Suburban tinted windows engine humming like a slow inhale. It didn't screech or flash its lights. It simply moved with certainty. Deliberate. Like it didn't need to prove anything. Like it already knew how this ended. The vehicle slowed to a crawl, then stopped directly behind the squad car. The officers turned, both startled. The younger one reached for his holster. The older officer narrowed his eyes. The driver's side door opened. A boot hit the pavement, then another, and out stepped a man dressed in black tactical gear, soaked from head to toe. His face obscured at first by the hood of his coat, then revealed as he pulled it down. Sharp eyes, square jaw, no hesitation. He surveyed the scene with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need a badge to be felt. Marla's breath caught in her chest. She knew that walk, knew the stillness in his stare, knew the way storms quieted around him. Maddox, her ex-husband, gone for 2 years. No phone calls, no explanations, just vanished into a life she thought had swallowed him whole. And now he was here. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. Her heart knocked against her ribs like it wanted out. Maddox stepped forward, one hand still by his waist near the clipped ID badge on his belt. The officers froze. The rain continued to fall, but something in the air had shifted. Everything was about to change. The moment he stepped out of the SUV, the air changed. The storm didn't stop, but it paused, as if even the wind needed to make room for Maddox Quinn. He closed the door behind him without rushing water beating on the matte black body of the vehicle. The hem of his coat flapped in the wind. Rainwater streamed down the sleeves of his tactical jacket, soaking into the fabric, but he didn't flinch. He looked like he'd walked out of the storm itself, shaped by it. Officer Drexel squinted instinctively, placing a hand on the butt of his holstered gun. Maddox's boot struck the pavement, slow and deliberate, echoing over the chaotic silence like a countdown no one had expected. Marla saw him through the squad car window, her breath fogging up the glass. For a moment, her mind refused to believe it. He was real, but he couldn't be. He was supposed to be gone, buried in another life, a ghost with a badge and 1,000 secrets. But there he was, solid, sharp-eyed, jaw tight with controlled fury. Drexel took a step forward. "Sir, this is an active scene. I need you to stand back." Maddox didn't stop. He pulled a badge from the inside of his jacket, a black leather fold, inside gold. Clean, heavy with federal weight. The rain caught on the edges as he held it up at eye level. Special Agent Maddox Quinn, Department of Internal Oversight and Public Ethics. Badge number 812MQ-FR5, he said, voice clear and low, meant for command, not conversation. "This woman is not your suspect. She's your witness. Now uncuff her." Drexel blinked, thrown off balance. She rear-ended the mayor's. She rear-ended a government-issued vehicle that shouldn't have been parked on this street. Maddox interrupted. "A vehicle registered to a shell company tied to Councilman Glenn's. That vehicle is part of an ongoing investigation into municipal fund laundering, obstruction of audits, and fraudulent contracts involving city infrastructure grants." He took another step forward. "And unless you want to be added to the report as a co-conspirator or obstructionist, I'd suggest you release her." The younger officer, who hadn't said a word until now, shifted his weight and subtly stepped back. Marla watched all of this in stunned silence. The rain blurred the edges of her view, but her eyes remained locked on him. The same man who used to fall asleep with her son, curled on his chest. The same man who vanished 2 years ago with no goodbye. Now he was standing between her and disaster. Drexel hesitated, glancing toward Glenn's, who was watching the scene unfold from beneath a massive umbrella held by a trembling assistant. "Maddox," Glenn's called out. "This is personal for you. You shouldn't be here." Maddox turned, slow, unhurried. "Everything became personal when you parked a stolen federal asset under your name and left a sick child to die in the back seat while you staged a civil claim." His words hit like thunder. Phones were still rolling. Someone behind a car door gasped. One of the bystanders muttered, "Did he just say stolen?" Drexel swallowed hard. "Show me your documentation," he finally managed. Without a word, Maddox pulled a waterproof folder from the inside of his jacket. He opened it, revealing a laminated authorization sheet stamped, signed, dated heavy with the kind of language only federal jurisdiction could carry. Drexel scanned it, blinked, read again. Then finally, with a slow exhale, he reached for his keyring. Click! The cuffs released. Marla gasped when the metal slid free from her raw wrists. Her arms fell into her lap like dead weight. The blood returning to her hands felt like fire and ice all at once. She turned her head slowly toward Maddox as he opened the squad car door. For the first time their eyes met, not as strangers, not as broken things, but as something else entirely. "Can you walk?" he asked her gently, his tone shifting for her alone. She nodded, but she lied. Her legs buckled slightly as she stepped out. He caught her with one arm around her waist, the other already moving to open the back door of her car. "Eli." Marla stumbled forward. Maddox pulled the boy into his arms with a practiced swiftness. The child was soaked lips, tinged blue eyelids fluttering. He didn't hesitate. "Back of the SUV," Maddox said. "There's a heated med platform and an emergency kit." They moved as one, her leaning on him carrying her son like a soldier shielding a fragile cargo. Behind them, the crowd was murmuring louder. Glenn shouted something, legal threats maybe, but no one listened anymore. Maddox opened the Suburban's back door and laid Eli gently onto the emergency stretcher built into the floor compartment. He reached for a red case marked Field Medical EP plus Anticonvulsive and opened it in a single motion. Marla hovered, still dazed, arms crossed over her chest, as if trying to keep herself from shattering. She watched as Maddox prepped the injection. Then he looked up at her. "Can I?" She nodded, biting her lip to stop it from trembling. He inserted the auto-injector into Eli's thigh. The child twitched, then stilled. Maddox checked his breathing, wiped the sweat and rain from the boy's forehead, then closed the case and turned to her. "We're taking him now." Marla opened her mouth, but no words came. Not thank you. Not how. Not why. She just climbed in beside her son, pressing her palm to his chest, feeling it rise finally, steadily. Maddox slid into the driver's seat. As he pulled away from the scene, headlights cut through the night. The SUV roared to life like a predator reclaimed. Red and blue sirens glared in the rearview mirror, but they didn't matter anymore. Marla looked out the window. People were still filming, still whispering, but for the first time all night she didn't care. Inside the warmth of the SUV and the presence of a man she once trusted, and maybe still did, Marla allowed herself to exhale. The hospital lights weren't far now, and this time, no one was going to stop them. The emergency room doors burst open with a hiss, swallowing them into white light and antiseptic air. Marla stumbled inside soaked clothes clinging to her body like wet regret. Her shoes squeaked on the linoleum. Her arms were empty now. Eli had been taken from her hands by the nurses, lifted onto a gurney, wheels shrieking as he was rushed through the sterile maze of the trauma bay. She stood still for a beat too long, hands hovering mid-air as if she still felt his weight. "Ma'am, you can wait there," a nurse said quickly, pointing to the wide corridor just off the trauma wing. Her voice was kind but practiced, detached. Marla nodded, wordless, moving, as if through fog. She sat down hard on the bench. The hallway was too bright, too clean, too quiet. The only sound was the distant blip of machines and the click of rubber soles on tile. She stared down at her hands, red rings around her wrists, remnants of the cuffs. Her fingers shook. Her palms still felt the shape of the steering wheel. Her son's twitching body, the cold slam of the patrol car door. A sob caught in her throat but didn't make it out. Instead, she reached into her soaked jacket pocket for her phone. Notifications. Dozens of them. She unlocked the screen, and there it was. The photo, her face frozen, mid-scream, hair matted to her cheeks, mascara bleeding down her eyes. A police officer standing behind her, the cuffs clearly visible. Eli blurred in the back seat. The caption read, "Mother arrested during medical emergency, reckless or manipulative." Her vision blurred. Comment after comment loaded beneath the image. Drama queen playing the victim again. Did she even call 911 or did she go full TikTok attention mode? "Where's CPS when you need them?" She scrolled. The hate came fast, like venom through a cracked glass. And then she saw it. Gwen Lewis. The name glared at her like a stain. Marla tapped it. A public post. 37 shares, over 200 comments. Some people will risk a child's life for sympathy. Just because you're loud doesn't mean you're right. Let's not confuse chaos for courage. She felt like she'd been punched in the ribs. A photo accompanied it. Gwen's backyard dry and pristine, unlike the storm-soaked mess Marla had escaped. In the caption, Gwen had added, "Maybe it's time certain people stop blaming others and start acting like adults." The comments were worse. People from the neighborhood chiming in, laughing emojis. Here she goes again. Didn't she get fired last year? She needs serious help. Marla's thumb hovered over the screen. She wanted to throw the phone. She wanted to scream until the hallway shattered, but she didn't move. Her body had already betrayed her buckled, beaten bent. Now her silence betrayed her too. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't have the energy to fight back. A soft sound made her glance up. Maddox stood a few feet away, watching her. His hair was slicked back, soaked at the edges. His tactical jacket unzipped, now the storm still clinging to his shoulders. He didn't speak right away, just walked over slowly, sat beside her elbows, resting on his knees. "I saw it," he said quietly, nodding toward the phone still trembling in her hand. She swallowed. "They're eating me alive." He didn't correct her, didn't offer any lines like "don't read the comments" or "they don't know you." He knew better, because he did know her. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. It was thick marked "confidential, internal use only." She stared at it like it might burn her fingers. "What is that?" "Everything they've done," Maddox said. He turned the envelope slowly in his hands. Documents, recordings, payment trails, a full year of surveillance. Gwen, the infrastructure committee. "It's bigger than we thought." She blinked. "Why are you giving it to me?" "Because they already made you the villain," he said. "Might as well let you be the storm now." Marla let out a bitter breath. Not quite a laugh, but not quite grief either. "I didn't ask for this," Maddox said, "but you're in it." She looked down at the folder. Her reflection caught in the shiny wax coating. She looked wrecked, destroyed. Her eyeliner was smeared. Her lips were cracked. Her wrists bore bruises shaped like betrayal. She looked like everything Gwen wanted her to look like: unhinged, unstable, undone. But Maddox wasn't looking at her like that. He never had. Her voice came low, nearly a whisper. "They think I wanted attention." He nodded once. "That's what power does. It makes everything your fault." Her fingers closed around the envelope. The paper was cold. It felt heavier than it should have. They almost let him die. Maddox didn't respond, but the silence was louder than words. Marla looked toward the double doors at the end of the hallway. Somewhere beyond them, Eli was lying on a steel table under fluorescent lights. Tubes in his arms, sensors on his chest. His little body fighting back because he always had to fight. She pressed her lips together, drew a breath that tasted like blood and bleach. "Do they know what's in here?" she asked, lifting the folder slightly. "Not yet," Maddox said, "but they will." She let her shoulders fall. Exhaustion pressed into her bones like gravity. But beneath that something stirred. Not rage. Not fear. Resolve. She wasn't going to be Gwen's punchline anymore. Not the HOA's cautionary tale. Not the internet's newest spectacle. She was going to be the thing that made them squirm. The woman who stood back up when everyone begged her to stay down. She looked at Maddox. His jaw was tight, his eyes unreadable. But there was something gentle there, too. Something quiet and patient and hard-earned. "You stayed away for 2 years," she said. "I had to." "Why?" He exhaled slowly. "Because if I'd come back too soon, I wouldn't have been ready. I would have come back angry. And anger burns fast. It doesn't finish anything." She studied him, and then she nodded. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was shared. Beyond the hallway, a chime rang. A nurse pushed open the trauma doors, looking around. Family for Eli Jensen. Marla shot to her feet. That's me. The nurse gave a small, tired smile. He's stable, still weak, but we got him back. Marla staggered, gripping the wall behind her. Tears filled her eyes, but didn't fall. She just closed them, let the moment soak in. Let it wash over the bruises, the cuffs, the lies, the laughter, the rain. Then she opened them again and nodded. Take me to him. And as the nurse led her forward, she didn't let go of the folder. It was soaked at the corners now, but she would carry it until it burned down the world. The hospital room was dim lit only by a single reading lamp over Eli's bed. Machines hummed in a gentle rhythm, tracking his pulse and oxygen. Each soft beep was a reassurance he was still here, still breathing. Marla sat beside him, her fingers gently curled around his hand. His skin was warm now, not clammy. His chest rose evenly, not in frantic, shallow bursts. It should have been a moment of peace. But her mind was elsewhere, back in the storm, back on the street, back to the cuffs cutting into her wrists, while her son convulsed behind glass. She looked down at her boy. What happens next? She whispered, not to him, but to the silence. A soft knock interrupted the quiet. Maddox stood at the door, no longer soaked, but just as grim. He nodded once, asking permission. She motioned him in. He walked to the window, opened the blinds slightly. Rain still tapped against the glass, but the worst of it had passed. Marla stood. Tell me. He didn't waste time. The vehicle Glenn's was driving tonight, registered under a non-existent company listed in a public health subcontract, he said, pulling a small flash drive from his pocket and holding it up. That company has received nearly $1.3 million in infrastructure disbursements over the past 16 months, all earmarked for community medical clinics that never existed. She blinked, heart tightening. You're saying he stole from people like Eli Maddox? Finished. Low-income families, special needs patients, veterans. They used the Community Wellness Access Fund as a front. It was approved, quietly backed by the HOA. And Gwen, he paused. Marla tilted her head. What? His jaw tensed. Gwen isn't just the HOA chair. She was the project liaison on every grant approval. Her signature's on every request. She's the one who pushed the budget expansions. She coordinated the press coverage. She made sure you weren't part of the committee. Marla sat back slowly. The edges of the picture began to snap into place. The cookies, the random pop-ins, the concerned texts, the way Gwen had always walked just a little too far into her kitchen. Just enough to touch things, to look like she was helping. You think it was her? Marla murmured. You think Gwen took the meds? Maddox didn't answer. He didn't need to. Marla stood and walked to her purse, opened it, dug out the brown case she always kept in the front zipper, the one that used to contain Eli's backup meds. She hadn't had time to open it during the chaos, hadn't dared. Now she did. Empty, except something caught the light. A smear of pink. She frowned, touched it. Sticky. Lip gloss. Not hers. Her gaze snapped upward, locking onto Maddox's. She planted it, she whispered. She opened it to make sure I'd panic. She wanted the seizure to happen. He stepped forward. Because you were getting too close. To what? Maddox reached into his folder again and handed her a series of printed reports. Names, dates, budgets. At the top, projected site locations. Maple Lane Community Health Pilot. She scanned the list. Her own address was there. Her name wasn't. They were going to use your property as a staging site, Maddox said. Then deny you any stake in it. A perfect excuse to push you out once things turned public. The moment you noticed, they'd discredit me. Marla finished almost breathless. She pressed a hand to her chest, suddenly aware of how fast her heart was racing. And it almost worked. Maddox looked at her carefully. You were a problem they needed gone. Gwen's blog post wasn't just commentary, it was a setup. They were already planning to say you were unstable. Marla sank back onto the edge of the bed. Her son stirred slightly but didn't wake. Her hand moved to his hair, brushing it gently from his face. She should have felt victorious. She didn't. You want me to go public with this? She asked. Maddox was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. I want you to make the choice. She met his eyes. He sat down across from her. His voice lowered. If we release this, it becomes a war. Gwen's reputation will collapse. Glenn's will lose his seat. Their donors will bury them. But Eli, she cut in, he'll be in the middle of it. Maddox nodded. They'll use him against you. They'll paint you as the mother who exposed her child's medical crisis for leverage. The woman who weaponized her trauma. She didn't respond. Her mind was already there, visualizing the next wave of comments, memes, doctored headlines. But if you stay quiet, Maddox added, they keep bleeding this community dry, and next time it might not be your kid. It might be someone else's who doesn't make it. The room fell still. Only the machines hummed. Marla stood again. She walked to the window and stared out. Below, the ER bay was still busy. Flashing lights, people rushing in and out, lives on the edge of breaking. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about erosion. Slow, quiet destruction of people who couldn't fight back. People like her. She turned to Maddox. They'll say I'm unfit. They already are. She nodded slowly. What if I lose him? Maddox's expression softened. You won't. You don't know that. No, he said gently. But I know what you'd lose if you didn't fight. Her hand tightened on the edge of the curtain. Not out of fear, out of clarity. For years she'd bent herself around expectations. She'd played nice. Apologized for being tired. For being angry. For being a mother to a sick child. She was done apologizing. She turned, walked over to the table and picked up the flash drive. Turned it in her hand like a loaded weapon. Then she looked at Maddox. Let's burn them to the ground. And somewhere beneath the storm, the first match was lit. It started with a folder. Simple. Manila. Edges still damp from the storm. Marla walked into the precinct with her chin raised, the bruises on her wrists, hidden beneath a long-sleeve cardigan that didn't quite cover the truth. Her heels clicked across the linoleum like they had a purpose, like the building had been waiting for her. And maybe in some way it had. At the front desk, the officer didn't look up right away. Then he did. Recognition flashed. She was no longer a nameless face in a patrol car. She was that woman. The one from the video. The one screaming in the rain while her son thrashed behind the glass. Can I help you? He asked, neutral but stiff. I'm here to file a complaint, she said, placing the folder on the counter. Formal misconduct. Use of excessive force. Neglect of medical emergency. And complicit obstruction in a federal corruption investigation. His brows rose just slightly. Then he cleared his throat and called for a supervisor. Within 20 minutes, she was seated in a small room under flickering fluorescent lights, giving a statement to a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She didn't care. Every word she spoke was carved from pain, but each syllable landed with conviction. She gave them the timeline, the medical records, the photographs. And finally, Maddox's documentation, sanitized, redacted, but admissible. When she stood to leave, her legs shook, but only for a second. Later that day, she submitted a matching packet to City Hall. This one went further. Accusations of fraud, bribery, medical endangerment. She handed it directly to the city clerk, who accepted it with the kind of tight-lipped smile reserved for people who'd just set off a bomb. That night her name trended in the county. And the firestorm began. It didn't come like a crash. It came like rot. The first article appeared on a local blog with the headline, Disgraced, Former Nurse Accuses Mayor of Corruption. Political Retaliation or Personal Vendetta. It included an image of Marla taken outside the precinct, looking tired, holding the same folder she'd just filed. The second article quoted Gwen. It's unfortunate that some individuals choose to weaponize false claims for attention. I've always had compassion for Marla, even when she made poor choices. But I won't allow my name to be dragged through the mud. Gwen had filed a countersuit. Defamation, character assassination, emotional damages, $250,000 in reputation loss. And she'd hired a PR firm. The morning news ran a segment. 2 anchors at a glossy white table discussed the story with cheerful disdain. A mother caught in the storm literally and figuratively. But is this about justice or just a personal grudge? The words burned. Marla watched it from her couch, Eli sleeping beside her, an oxygen monitor clipped to his finger. Maddox stood in the kitchen, jaw clenched. "She's controlling the narrative," he muttered. Marla didn't reply. She was too busy reading the comments. Again, always the comments. This is what happens when you give broken people a platform. Where's the father in all this? Mental illness looks a lot like activism these days. Then came the knock. A courier? Legal envelope? Marla took it with steady hands. Inside, the official notification from the court, Gwen's lawsuit filed, stamped in public. At the bottom, in crisp blue ink, Gwen's signature. Elegant. Cold. She didn't even hesitate, Marla whispered. Maddox set down his coffee cup hotter than necessary. "She's trying to bury you in paperwork so you stop digging." "I'm not stopping." "I know." He paused. There was something different about his silence now. Not tense. Just waiting. She turned to face him. "What?" he exhaled slowly. "I've been pulled from the case." Marla blinked. "What?" "They reassigned me this morning. Said I compromised my objectivity." She laughed sharp bitter. "You mean because you refused to let a child die in the rain?" Maddox didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Who did it?" she asked. "Glenn's has friends. Higher up than we thought. Quiet ones." "Of course he does." She sank onto the couch beside Eli. Rested her hand on his chest. Felt it rise. Steady. Precious. She didn't cry. She couldn't afford to. "They think I'll back off," she said. "They're hoping you'll burn out." Marla looked down at her son. Not a symbol, not a tool, just a boy. Her boy. The reason she'd stood in the rain with cuffs slicing into her skin and still didn't scream. The reason she hadn't run. The reason she wasn't going to now. "You still have access to the files, don't you?" she asked Maddox. "I'm not supposed to." She looked up. "But you do." He didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. "Then I want everything she said. Every receipt, every signature, every fake invoice, every grant Gwen approved with a smile." He nodded once. "I'll get it to you." She stood. Her voice didn't shake anymore. "Let them sue me. Let them smear my name. I'll answer every lie with truth. They want a war." She looked toward the window where rain had begun again, soft, steady. "I'll show them what it costs to silence a mother." Outside, across the street, Gwen's porch light blinked on. A camera tilted downward. She was watching, always watching. But this time Marla was watching back, and she was done blinking first. It arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address. Wedged between hospital bills and a flyer for flu shots, the letter looked innocuous. Just another piece of paper in a tired woman's mailbox. Marla didn't notice it at first. Not until she reached for the envelope from the mailbox with Eli's name misspelled on the address label. She opened it on the kitchen counter, one hand still cradling her phone, scrolling through more legal updates. The flap tore unevenly. A single sheet of printer paper slipped out. No greeting, no signature. Just a few typed lines in bold block letters. "You think you're protecting him. You're not. Back off or we'll finish what the seizure couldn't." She stared at it for a long time. Her fingers went numb first, then her knees. She sank into the nearest chair like her bones had dissolved. Her eyes read it again and again, but the words didn't change. The air felt thicker. Her ears rang. A familiar panic rose in her throat, the one that whispered, "They're always watching. You'll never be safe. You were stupid to fight." Maddox, she called, barely able to get the word out. He was at the sink, rinsing dishes in silence, lost in his own world of stress and damage control. He turned quickly, saw her face, and froze. "What is it?" She handed him the letter. He read it once, then again. His hand clenched the paper tight, crumpling it as he read it a third time, slower this time, each word pressed into him like heat. "Did you open this outside?" he asked. She shook her head. "Here, just now." "Where's Eli?" "He's with the nurse, sleeping." Maddox didn't wait. He grabbed his jacket and checked his sidearm out of habit, out of instinct. The silence between them carried the full weight of shared alarm. The hospital hallway was quiet, too quiet. Maddox's footsteps echoed sharp off the tile. He moved like a shadow, smooth and controlled, scanning each doorway with the precision of a man trained to walk toward chaos. Marla rushed behind him, adrenaline giving her a second wind. When they turned the final corner toward Eli's private room, Maddox stopped. The door was cracked open. Marla's heart dropped. They had left it shut. Always. She surged forward. Eli. Before Maddox could stop her, she burst into the room. Inside, the lights were dimmed. Eli was awake, sitting upright, trembling. His chest heaved with uneven breaths. His eyes were wide and unfocused, locked on the far corner of the room. He pointed with a shaking finger. There was someone here. Marla reached him in 2 strides, wrapping him in her arms, feeling his whole body shudder against her. There was a man, he whispered, voice broken. He touched my arm. I screamed and he ran. Maddox scanned the space. Nothing obvious was disturbed. The IV line was still intact. The monitors still beeped softly, but the window was cracked open, and Eli's emergency button taped beside his bed was missing. Gone. Ripped clean off. Maddox moved fast, radioing security. 10 minutes later, 2 guards were reviewing footage from the hallway camera. But somehow the recording for that wing between 3:07 and 3:15 a.m. was corrupted, just static. Marla sat beside Eli, holding his hand, watching the nurses resecure every lock, every latch, every file. But something inside her had already snapped. It wasn't fear anymore. It was fury. She stood quiet and slow, her hands steady. Maddox saw the shift in her expression the second she turned. "What are you thinking?" he asked cautiously. She met his eyes. No more waiting. No more files. No more secrets. He hesitated. "Marla, they threatened my son. In print. In person." Her voice cracked, but it didn't waver. "They got into a locked room in a hospital. That's not fear, that's war." Maddox didn't speak, but his jaw flexed. "I don't care what it costs anymore," she continued. "Reputation, money, custody. None of it matters if I'm sitting over a headstone 6 months from now because I played it safe." She walked to her bag, pulled out the flash drive, held it in her palm like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "I want this out there. All of it. Tonight." He stepped toward her slowly. "Once it's public, there's no undoing it. They will hit back. Hard. And fast." She nodded. "Then we hit first." "Where?" "Everywhere." Maddox looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly he pulled out his phone. "Then we better move fast. I know someone who can help." That night, Marla sat at the foot of Eli's bed, watching his chest rise and fall. He'd finally drifted to sleep again, exhaustion pulling him under like a tide. She held her laptop in her lap. A fresh file open, her name at the top. Not a complaint, not a request, not a whisper, a declaration. Her voice, her story, her proof. She uploaded the hospital footage, the screenshots of the financial records, the scanned copies of her complaint, every page Gwen and Glenn's thought would die in a drawer somewhere. And then she recorded a video. Just her. No makeup, no filters. Just raw, furious truth. "My name is Marla Jensen," she began. And for the next 6 minutes, she told the world what happened the night they cuffed her in the rain while her son seized in the back seat. She told them how Gwen infiltrated her home, how the health grants vanished, how the systems meant to protect had failed over and over. And she ended it with the letter, the threat, the window. "My child's life was used as leverage. You don't get to do that and stay anonymous. Not anymore." She uploaded the video to every platform she had. Then she clicked post, and for the first time in weeks she sat still. The storm outside returned thunder low and deep, but inside it was quiet, clear, because fear had already lost, and now it was her turn. The cursor hovered over the red Go Live button. Marla stared at it for a long breath. Outside the hospital room window, dawn had begun bleeding faint blue into the sky, but inside the air was tense and electric. Eli slept behind her, his small body curled beneath thin white blankets, safe for now, but only just. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the phone mounted on the small tripod Maddox had rigged using a coffee cup and surgical tape. No makeup, no filters, just her swollen eyes, chapped lips, and the tight coil of rage coiled beneath her ribs. She tapped live, and the world opened. "Hi, my name is Marla Jensen," she began. "Some of you know me as the woman who got handcuffed in the rain while my son had a seizure in the back seat." The screen blinked as the first wave of viewers trickled in, names popping up, hearts floating. But Marla wasn't watching the numbers. "I've stayed quiet. I've tried to follow the rules, file the paperwork, be polite, be small, be non-threatening." Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It carried, but quiet didn't save my son. Quiet almost got him killed. The number in the corner began climbing. Hundreds, then over 1,000. Marla reached beside her, picked up the flash drive, and slid it into the port of her laptop. The interface changed. She pulled up an audio file titled HOA Call, Gwen Glens, March 14th, and she hit play. Recording begins. Gwen's voice, Marla's unstable. She cries over everything. One push and she'll snap. Glens. Then push her. We just need a scene enough to discredit her if she opens her mouth. You said she's behind on rent. Gwen. Not anymore, unfortunately. Maddox came back. He's a problem. Glens, handle it. You're good at pretending to bake cookies and burying knives. Laughter. Gwen again. She's too nosy. She keeps asking about where the clinic fund went. If she starts connecting dots, this whole damn HOA umbrella collapses. Glens. Let her connect them. We'll ruin her before she finishes the picture. Recording ends. The comment section exploded. Lines blurred across the screen too fast to follow. Wait. Did they just admit to setting her up? That was the mayor. She was right. All this time. Marla took a breath. That's just one file. There are 14 more. Invoices dummy corporations' expense reports with Gwen's digital signature on every transfer of public health funding into Glens' private consulting firm. She clicked open the PDF files on the screen, scrolling through page after page of dates, approvals, transfers, receipts. No one was meant to see. All of it was meant to disappear in silence. Buried under HOA jargon, legal threats, and media spin, her hands tightened around the edges of the table. But I'm done being quiet, and so should you. By the 5-minute mark, the stream passed 10,000 viewers, then 30,000. The chat was on fire. Journalists started dropping in. Verified accounts, law professors, civil rights groups, and then came the hashtag. It started in lowercase, a ripple. Justice for Marla. Someone posted a clip of her cuffed in the rain juxtaposed with the audio she'd just played. Within minutes it was trending. Memes turned into infographics. TikToks turned into video essays. People who didn't even live in the state started following the story. Screenshots of Gwen's blog post calling Marla emotionally unstable were dragged into the light and torn apart in comment threads. Old photos of Glens smiling with developers were recontextualized beneath headlines about corruption. A storm was brewing, and this time it wasn't weather. It was rage. By the time Marla ended the live stream, her inbox was overflowing. Emails, DMs, missed calls. But one message stood out. Subject line: pro bono representation available immediately. Civil Rights Division. It was from a woman named Simone Rain, civil rights attorney, former DOJ. Her message was simple. I saw your stream. I've seen enough. If you're ready to fight, we fight. My team is yours. Marla stared at the screen. A few days ago, no one would take her calls. Her neighbors pretended not to see her. Gwen owned the story, and Glens owned the systems. But now, she owned the truth. Maddox entered quietly, 2 cups of coffee in hand. You lit a match, he said, nodding at the screen. She nodded back. Now we watch them burn. He set the cup beside her. You okay? She turned slowly, watching Eli sleep. His chest rose, fell, rose. For the first time in a long time? Yeah, she said. I am. Across town, Gwen's phone rang nonstop. She ignored every call. Her notifications piled up in red badges she refused to open. Then a knock came at her door. She peered through the peephole and went pale. A news van parked at the curb. Microphones, cameras. Neighbors stared as reporters gathered. One of them pointed at the front of her house. A delivery truck pulled up at that exact moment, dropping a stack of papers. Subpoenas. And just like that, the tide turned. For months, they'd told her she was crazy. Overreacting. Dangerous. But in less than 5 hours, Marla Jensen became something else. Not just a mother. Not just a victim. She became a name that carried weight. She became a voice they couldn't drown out. And outside the hospital, beneath a sky no longer broken by rain, strangers stood with handwritten signs. We believe you. We are Marla. Justice for Marla lit up the night like neon, and it was only just beginning. The camera footage was grainy, but no one missed the moment the cuffs clicked around Mayor Glenn's wrists. It happened just after 9:00 a.m. inside the sunlit marble lobby of City Hall. The mayor, still wearing his signature silk tie and arrogant smile, barely had time to look surprised before a team of federal agents swept in, their jackets marked FBI, their voices crisp with authority. People stopped moving. Phones came up. A receptionist's coffee trembled in her hand as she whispered, "Is that real?" It was. The agent leading the charge, a woman with close-cropped hair and mirrored sunglasses, read out the charges as she stepped forward. "Robert Glens, you are under arrest for wire fraud, misuse of public funds, obstruction of federal investigation, and conspiracy to commit targeted defamation under the Whistleblower Protection Act." Glens opened his mouth, closed it. Then slowly he raised his hands. The silence in the lobby cracked open with camera shutters and gasps. And across the city, live-streamed footage from an intern's shaky phone hit the internet like a thunderclap. Marla was watching from the hospital cafeteria. She stood completely still as the scene unfolded on screen. Glens being led away in handcuffs, reporters screaming questions, his mouth opening in disbelief like he'd just been caught stealing cookies, not millions. Maddox stood beside her, arms crossed, nodding once. "You did this," he said. "No," she whispered. "We did." She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just watched justice, real, tangible justice, march a monster out of power in broad daylight. Across town, Gwen Lewis was packing. Her designer luggage sat open on the marble-tiled floor of her kitchen, and her hands moved fast, grabbing cash bundles. A jewelry pouch, a burner phone still in its original box. She was dressed for discretion. Black joggers, hoodie, baseball cap. But panic betrayed her, making her fumble with zippers and drop her passport twice. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She didn't answer. Outside, a low hum built on the street. Then came the knock. Firm, repetitive. Not cops. Neighbors. The same ones Gwen had smiled at through fences. The same ones she'd scolded for letting their grass grow half an inch too long. The ones she'd ignored unless she needed votes. Now they stood on her porch, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Mrs. Carter from next door. Tom Nguyen with his arms folded like a judge. One of them held up an envelope, a printout of Marla's livestream transcript. "You're not running," Carter said. Gwen laughed nervously. "Excuse me?" "You set her up," Tom said. "You lied to all of us." "I don't owe you anything," Gwen spat. "I've done more for this community than any of you have." "That's what Glenn said too," Carter replied. "Look where he is." Gwen moved to push past them, dragging her suitcase behind her. Tom stepped in front of it. "You're not going anywhere." Her voice cracked. "Get out of my way." Then she saw the phones. Half a dozen neighbors all filming. Silent, steady. It wasn't the police that stopped her. It was the people she'd spent years manipulating. Now they were her walls. Online hem justice for Marla became something else entirely. It mutated, multiplied, trending across multiple countries. Covered by BuzzFeed, Vox, CNN, even the BBC. A side-by-side image went viral. Marla in handcuffs beneath pouring rain. Eli in the back seat, contrasted with Glenn's in cuffs, sweat bleeding through his collar in a bright, air-conditioned lobby. The caption read, "Which one looks dangerous now?" Thousands of women reshared it with stories of their own. I wasn't believed either. They called me dramatic too. This is what happens when you underestimate a mother. Suddenly Marla wasn't just a woman who'd survived a night of hell. She was a movement, a symbol, a reckoning. News anchors corrected themselves. Marla Jensen, once described as unstable, was now a resilient mother who refused to stay silent. Journalists scrambled to revise their narratives. Editorial boards issued clarifying statements. Talk shows invited her to speak. One morning show opened with, "Today we honor a woman who fought not just for her child but for every family failed by the system." She declined all of it, not out of spite, out of clarity. The fight wasn't over. That night she sat beside Eli in the hospital room. He was awake, playing with a small plastic figurine Maddox had given him. The color had returned to his cheeks. His smile wasn't forced. She stroked his hair as the news played on the muted TV. Gwen's mugshot had been released. So had Glenn's. There was satisfaction in it, but not revenge. This wasn't about watching them fall. It was about proving that her voice had weight, that her life, her son's life, mattered. Maddox entered holding his phone. "They just filed formal charges," he said. The department's launching a statewide audit of all health grant allocations tied to Gwen's companies. 3 more council members are under investigation. Marla nodded. I thought I'd feel more triumphant, she said. You're not done yet, he said. That's why. She looked over at Eli. His small hand reached for hers, wrapped around it, warm, steady. I'll never be done, she whispered. Not until every door Gwen ever closed on her opened for someone else. Not until silence stopped being a requirement for survival. Not until justice was more than a moment on a screen. She stood and walked to the window, watching the distant skyline shimmer under floodlights. Somewhere out there Gwen was behind bars, and somewhere even further another mother was being told to calm down, to sit still, to stop making noise. Marla smiled faintly. Let her be the reason they screamed louder. The sky above the city was clear again, not just from rain but from noise, from outrage, from fear. In the quiet that followed justice, everything felt sharper, crisper, as if even the air had recalibrated. Marla stood at the edge of the hospital garden where hydrangeas bloomed beside a weathered bench. Eli was resting upstairs, his latest scans better than anyone had expected. The medical team now called him the Storm Kid, like surviving had made him myth. Maddox stood nearby. He wasn't in his suit. No badge, no earpiece. Just jeans, a soft black tee, and a hesitant expression that hadn't shown itself during interrogations or arrests. This was a different battlefield now. I've been reassigned, he said. She nodded. I figured. He looked down at the ground, scuffing a toe against the sidewalk. Baltimore, field office. It's not permanent, but long enough. She didn't say anything. The wind moved around them, gentle and cool. Finally he looked at her. You and Eli could come with me. The words hung there, not rushed, not begged, just offered. He stepped closer. We could start over. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere they don't know your face or mine. We could find a place near good schools. I could be there this time. He searched her face. You wouldn't have to fight anymore. Marla smiled softly, sadly. I'll always have to fight Maddox, she said. Just maybe in different ways. He looked down again. Right. She reached out and touched his arm. It's not because I don't believe you, she said gently. It's because I finally believe myself. His eyes flicked up. I built a version of me around fear, around needing someone to hold me up. But that woman's gone. She left the night they put cuffs on me and I didn't shatter. He took a breath, steady but quiet. I was wrong to leave the way I did, he said. I thought protecting you meant vanishing, but all I did was leave you to fight alone. You didn't, she replied. You came back, right when it mattered most. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her hand resting gently over his heart. And I'll never forget that. Silence again, but not an empty one. It was the silence that lives in the spaces between goodbyes, not sorrow but reverence. He nodded. One tear slipped from the corner of his eye, but he didn't wipe it away. You're extraordinary, you know that, he whispered. I do now. They embraced, not like lovers, like something older, something deeper, a bond forged through fire, through hospital rooms and threats and confessions, through memory and mourning and long, lonely nights neither of them had ever spoken about. When they pulled apart, her fingers lingered on his sleeve. All right, he said. She nodded. Send Eli postcards. He collects them now. He smiled. Then slowly he stepped back, walked down the garden path through the gate and toward the city beyond. She stood there long after he disappeared from view, alone, but never broken. Inside her pocket was the flyer she'd been carrying all week, a proposal to convert an abandoned church downtown into a community health center. She'd spoken to the city, applied for a grant, found a few volunteers. She wasn't going anywhere, not when there were still people who needed care, still families navigating broken systems and silence. She would turn her scars into bricks, her grief into foundation, her name into a place where other mothers wouldn't have to beg for permission to be heard. And the wind shifted again, warm this time. She looked up at the sky, then turned back toward the hospital, toward Eli, toward the next chapter. And the sound of her footsteps, steady and strong, echoed into the silence she now claimed as her own. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no glossy flyers, no press conferences, just a hand-painted sign that read, Green Rain Health Center, and a line of folding chairs filled with single mothers, veterans, and kids with hollow eyes who hadn't been touched by safety in far too long. Marla stood at the doorway in her scrub jacket, not new, but clean. Behind her, the inside of the old church was reborn in paint and purpose. The pews had been replaced with exam tables and play corners. The altar was now a reception desk. The stained glass still cast colored light across the walls, but instead of solemnity, it lit up hope. She turned the key in the front door and welcomed the first patient. It started slowly. A mother with twins, both asthmatic and uninsured. An elderly man with early-onset dementia turned away from 3 clinics in 1 week. A teenager who hadn't spoken since her assault. They came one by one, and Marla said yes. She had turned the city's shame, the payout they'd offered, to silence her into walls that whispered, "You belong here." She didn't hire from resumes. She hired from story. A nurse who'd survived domestic violence. A counselor in recovery. A receptionist who'd once lived in her car but never lost her smile. Together they built something that looked nothing like the hospitals that had once shut their doors on people like them. They served tea in the waiting room. They kept crayons and books for restless little hands. They let people cry during check-ins, and no one ever had to explain why they were tired. Eli was the first to run the halls like they were a playground. He'd stopped flinching at night sounds, stopped asking if the door was locked twice. His seizures were less frequent now, his medications monitored by people who saw more than just charts. He had a small circle of friends. A boy named Ricky, who limped but laughed the loudest. A girl named Mira, who wore a cape every day because she said superheroes don't have to be big. One afternoon, Marla peeked through the cracked door to the break room and saw them sitting in a circle coloring. Eli was telling a joke. The other kids were laughing. Her heart broke and mended all at once, because that was all she ever wanted. Not applause, not headlines, just that sound her son's laughter unburdened. Donations started coming in. Quiet ones at first slipped through the mail slot. Then bigger ones tied to names she'd never heard. Some came from people who had watched her live stream and recognized themselves in her trembling voice. Others came from parents who said, "I wish someone like you had been there for us." She turned no one away, not because she was a saint, because she remembered the night the pharmacy closed too early, the night the storm wouldn't stop, the night no one would look her in the eye as she begged for her son's life. Every corner of the clinic was a rebellion, and every patient was a reminder. That silence had once tried to kill her. Now it only made her stronger. One morning, Eli tugged at her coat as she stood beneath the flowering dogwood tree they'd planted behind the building. "Mom," he asked, blinking against the sunlight. "Are we rich now?" She smiled. "Why do you ask?" "Because we have our own building." She crouched down, brushed a leaf from his hair. "We're not rich in money, baby, but we're rich in second chances." He considered that. "Is that better?" She nodded. "It's the best kind of rich." He grinned. "Can I be a doctor here when I grow up?" Her throat tightened. She nodded again, more slowly this time. "You can be anything." And she meant it. Because here possibility wasn't fiction. It was bricks. It was blood. It was a mother's stubborn refusal to quit. Later that week, Marla sat in her tiny office reviewing intake forms while sunlight streamed through the blinds. She paused on one name someone knew. Another single mom. 3 kids. 2 part-time jobs. No health insurance. She sighed, smiled, and scribbled in the margin. "We'll find a way." A knock came. It was Simone Rain, the attorney who had once sent that midnight email offering to help now one of the clinic's board members. "I have news," Simone said. "State funding approved. You're officially getting the community clinic designation." Marla blinked. Simone handed her the letter. Official seal. Real signatures. "You'll be able to expand," Simone added. "More staff. More services." Marla leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment before whispering, "We did it." "No," Simone corrected. "You did." They shared a quiet smile, and in that stillness Marla felt it again. Not survival, not vindication. Life. Full, real, undeniable. At closing hour, Eli helped sweep the waiting room while Marla wiped down surfaces. "Why do you always clean everything yourself?" he asked. She looked down at him. "Because it reminds me I'm still part of this place. Not just the one who built it. He nodded. Can I clean too? She handed him a cloth. Together they wiped the fingerprints from the glass door. Tomorrow more would come, but tonight it shone clean like the future, and for the first time in a very long time, Marla Jensen wasn't running. She wasn't breaking. She was building. From rain, from ruin, from resolve. The knock came just as the last patient left. Soft, polite, deadly. Marla glanced at the clock. Nearly 600 p.m. Most of the staff had gone home. Eli was upstairs napping in the playroom, exhausted from another day of running, laughing, healing. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front door, and froze. Gwen Lewis stood on the other side, perfectly dressed. White trench coat, gold earrings, her hair in a severe bun like nothing had changed since the last press conference she'd fumbled through before disappearing. But her eyes, they were colder, hungrier. Marla opened the door halfway. Gwen, she said, her voice even. Gwen didn't smile. She didn't blink. Instead, she extended a folder across the threshold. Legal paper, cream-colored, stamped. Court petition, she said, filed this morning. Marla took the folder but didn't open it. You're trying this again? Gwen exhaled as if she were the aggrieved party. Your mental health has always been unstable, Marla. The records speak for themselves. Panic attacks, dissociation, erratic behavior in public spaces. She glanced toward the hallway where Eli's art hung taped to the wall. None of this looks safe. Marla didn't flinch. You're standing in a building paid for by the truth you tried to bury. Gwen's expression didn't move. I'm not here to rehash. I'm here for the boy. I'm offering him something real. Stability, protection. I have a team now. And yes, lawyers. Marla opened the folder and scanned the first page. Custody motion, emergency filing, temporary injunction, based on what she asked. Based on your trauma, Gwen said smoothly. On your choices, on the company you keep. Marla closed the folder slowly, then smiled. But it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile born in fire, the kind forged by storms. She walked back behind the front desk and pulled out her phone. You know, she said as she swiped, I've been waiting for this. Not because I feared it, but because I knew you couldn't help yourself. Gwen tilted her head. What are you doing? Marla turned the volume up, then pressed play. Recording begins. Gwen's voice arrogant, laughing clear. You think anyone cares if that boy drops dead? He's a liability. That's all he's ever been. Let her scream. Let her live stream. The moment she snaps, and she will, I'll be there to collect the pieces. Marla Jensen's just another broken mother with delusions of justice. And you know what we do with women like her? We discredit, then discard. Recording ends. The silence that followed was deafening. Gwen paled. Behind her, the lawyer, mid-30s, clean-cut, trembling, slightly reached for the file in Marla's hand. I'd like to withdraw that motion, he said, his voice barely audible. Marla didn't move. Gwen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. You're not just cruel, Marla said softly. You're predictable. She stepped forward now, closing the gap between them. You came into my home, poisoned my name, threatened my child, and tried to weaponize my past. You thought the world would watch me drown again? But this time people were listening. Her voice sharpened. I don't need to scream anymore, Gwen. I just need to press play. The lawyer cleared his throat again, louder now. We're leaving. Marla handed him the folder. You do that. They turned without another word. But before Gwen stepped through the doorway, she glanced back. Her face was no longer smug. It was crumbling, cracked at the edges. You think this is the end? She whispered. Marla didn't answer with words. She simply closed the door and locked it. Back inside the building, exhaled. The walls held no tension. The air was safe again. Marla leaned against the frame for a long breath, then walked down the hall toward Eli's room. He was awake now, stacking blocks and humming a tune she didn't recognize. When he saw her, he lit up. Mom, come see my spaceship. She knelt beside him and ran a hand through his soft curls. It's perfect, she said. You okay? He asked, studying her face. She kissed his forehead. I am now. Outside, Gwen's world was unraveling. The internet had already caught the clip. Someone had forwarded the recording before Marla even opened the door. The press was circling again, but this time with no patience for false saints. But inside Green Rain, a spaceship was being built from blocks. and Marla Jensen had finally won a battle without raising her voice, just by refusing to be afraid. It began with a letter slipped through the mail slot plain envelope, no stamp. Marla had almost tossed it, assuming it was another flyer for urgent care discounts or a coupon for cleaning supplies. But the handwriting stopped her. Delicate, slanted, almost trembling. She opened it slowly, sitting on the edge of her desk in the early quiet of the morning, before the clinic bustled alive with the day's wait. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. Dear Marla, I was wrong. I watched you beg for help that night. I thought you were making a scene. I laughed when they arrested you. I believed what Gwen said because it was easier than asking questions. I'm sorry, truly. My daughter hasn't been sleeping. She's afraid of doctors now. She's afraid of people. But she asked me to bring her here because she saw your video. She saw how you fought. She said you looked like someone who would believe her. Thank you for staying when so many of us turned away. Please help us if you can. Amanda, the Blue House. 3 doors down, Marla held the letter in both hands, not crying, not smiling, just feeling the full weight of recognition that doesn't come with noise but with truth. Later that week, Amanda showed up in person, holding her daughter's hand. They stood in the reception line like everyone else, no fanfare, no special request. Just eyes that carried shame, and a hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still room for healing. Marla stepped out from behind the counter. Amanda's lips parted maybe to speak, but Marla simply opened her arms, and they hugged. Quiet, unforced. The girl, maybe 6 years old, clung to Marla's leg, then whispered, My mommy said you were the bravest person on TV. Marla knelt beside her. I think your mommy's pretty brave, too. More came after that. The man who once recorded her being cuffed brought his grandson in for speech therapy. The grocery clerk who had smirked during her arraignment now delivered fresh fruit weekly to the clinic, no charge. Even the mailman changed his route to bring their packages in person, always handing them directly to Marla with a nod like he'd been waiting to make eye contact. They didn't all apologize with words. Some brought flowers. Some just lingered longer in the lobby. But they came, not to gawk, not to forgive themselves. They came because they realized justice wasn't a headline. It was a place, and Marla had built it. One afternoon, a local news station requested an interview. She declined. But the producer, a woman named Renee with tired eyes, and a voice that didn't pretend, said, I don't want the story that went viral. I want the story that stayed. Marla hesitated, then invited her in. The segment aired a week later. No dramatics, just snapshots of the clinic. Eli's artwork on the wall. Marla talking softly about second chances. A few patient testimonials voice-masked for privacy, but the headline, Green Rain, the storm that healed a city, and the quote that followed her everywhere after that, some storms destroy, but some clean the air. She was the kind that made things grow again. People wrote in. Hundreds of letters. Most of them began with, I didn't believe you at first. But they all ended with thank you for not giving up. Marla didn't read them all at once. She kept them in a wooden box near her desk beside the photo of her and Eli under their umbrella the morning after the worst night of their lives. She'd look at them on quiet days, on hard days, on days she doubted if it all mattered, because even warriors need reminders that the fight wasn't for nothing. One night, long after the clinic had closed and the cleaning crew had gone, Eli walked into her office holding something behind his back. He was grinning, suspiciously. What are you hiding? She asked, turning from her laptop. Something he said, stepping closer. He handed her a folded sheet of printer paper, the kind they used for coloring. But there were no doodles this time, just words, big blocky handwriting. Dear Mom, you are the best mom in the world. You make the bad people go away. You give people medicine and hugs. You build places and hearts and smiles. I want to be you when I grow up. You are my hero. Love, Eli. She didn't cry right away. She just held it, then reached for him. And when she finally pulled him into her lap and kissed his cheek, he giggled. What's so funny? She asked. You're crying, he said, wiping her cheek. But it's not the sad kind. She laughed through it. No, baby. It's the kind that means I remembered why I never gave up. Outside rain began to fall again, But it wasn't a storm. Not this time. Just gentle, steady, the kind that helped things bloom. The morning began the way the best days often do, not with a bang, but a hush. A kind of reverent stillness that settled over the parking lot, over the folding chairs, arranged in tidy rows over the freshly painted sign that now read, Green Rain Health Center, Children's Wing in honor of second chances. It was the first time Marla allowed herself a ceremony, not to be honored, not for fanfare, but because this moment, this sunrise belonged to more than just her. It belonged to the mothers with trembling hands, to the fathers who didn't know how to ask for help, to the children who had learned how to survive before they learned how to read. It belonged to Eli. He stood beside her, practically vibrating with nervous energy. A red ribbon stretched across the new wing's front door. A plastic pair of oversized ceremonial scissors rested in his hands. "Do I do it now?" he whispered. "Wait for Simone," Marla murmured back, nodding toward the lawyer-turned-board member now at the mic. Simone was thanking donors, listing names, outlining what the expansion would include: a therapy room, a dedicated pediatric neurologist, a sensory garden. But Marla only half heard it. Her eyes stayed on the crowd, and on the edges. The neighborhood had shown up in full. Families that once crossed the street to avoid her now carried balloons and casserole dishes. A few reporters lingered at the back, taking notes quietly, no longer interested in drama, just witness. One elderly woman wept silently through the entire speech, clutching a photograph of her son lost to an untreated illness 20 years ago. Even the city sent a representative, a new one this time, young, earnest, grateful to be on the right side of history. But then, just past the church fence near the edge of the sidewalk, Marla saw her. Gwen, not in designer clothes. No sharp heels, no clipboard, no entourage. Just a beige coat too big for her frame, and a pair of sunglasses that did little to hide the shadow in her face. She wasn't standing. She was passing, or pretending to, but her feet had slowed, and her eyes, those once commanding eyes, looked up, right at Marla. For a moment everything paused. Simone's voice faded into the background. Eli's fidgeting went still. Time bent, suspended in the air between two women who had once shared holiday tables and neighborhood barbecues and who now stood as ruins of each other's past. Gwen's face was drawn, not with rage, not with pride, with something worse. Recognition and shame. Marla didn't flinch. She didn't wave. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded once, soft and unshaken, as if to say, "You are no longer a storm in my sky." And Gwen turned and walked away. Then applause. Marla blinked. Simone had finished speaking. Someone handed Eli the scissors. "Go on, buddy," she said softly. He looked up at her bright-eyed. "Can I say something first?" She raised a brow. "You want the mic?" He nodded. The crowd chuckled warmly as Simone lowered the stand to his height. Eli cleared his throat. He was missing one front tooth. His jacket was slightly crooked, but his voice steady. "My name is Eli Jensen," he said. "And my mom built this place after people told her she couldn't. But she did." Marla's throat tightened. "She helped me when I got sick. And then she helped a lot of other people, too. She's the best mom. And I hope when I grow up I can be someone who doesn't quit." A few claps, a few tears. Then he turned and sliced through the ribbon in one clean cut. The crowd erupted. "And Marla," she cried, not the kind of tears that collapse you, the kind that raise you from the inside out. It began to rain, not hard, just a drizzle. A soft mist that felt less like weather and more like blessing. People pulled up hoods and laughed, but no one ran. No one scattered. Marla stood under the eave of the building and watched them, all of them. She watched a single mom receive a business card from a volunteer. A child spin in slow circles with her tongue out to catch the rain. An elderly man in a veteran's cap wipe his eyes and whisper, "Thank you, Miss Jensen." And in that quiet where applause had ended and the drizzle tapped gently on the roof, Marla realized this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning, the true beginning, because survival is not the same as healing, and silence is not peace. But today, this sunlight through the rain, this child with scissors, this neighborhood rediscovering its own heart, this was peace. Earned, built, loved into existence. She stepped out into the rain, no umbrella, no coat. Eli ran to her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Did I do good?" he asked. She kissed the top of his head. "You changed everything," and for once the world agreed. The clinic was quiet, not the heavy quiet of exhaustion or grief, but the kind that came after long days that meant something. Purposeful silence, like the earth was holding its breath and smiling. Marla sat alone in her office, the sun dripping golden light across the desk. The last patient had gone home. The reception area was dark, save for the soft glow of the thank you banner, still strung between two walls, left over from the expansion ceremony. A single folder rested in front of her, the final chart of the day. She reviewed it slowly. Not because she had to, but because she still believed in reading every word, even after all this time. Every heartbeat mattered. Heartbeat. When she finished, she closed it gently, as if tucking a story into sleep. Then she exhaled. Long, quiet, free. On top of the folder lay an envelope. No return address. She turned it over and opened it. The handwriting was uneven, the ink slightly smudged. "Dear Marla, you don't know me, but I know you. I saw you on my screen that night, the live stream. I was 3 months postpartum alone, broke, bleeding emotionally in a way no ER could treat. I had one hand on a bottle of sleeping pills and the other on my baby girl's blanket. I was ready to disappear, and then you showed up. Not perfect, not polished, but fighting like your life depended on it. And your sons did. You said things no one dared say, that we're not weak when we cry, that survival is not the end of the story. I watched you scream in the rain and still not break. And something in me said, if she can keep going, maybe I can too. I'm still here, because of you. My daughter is learning to walk. I'm applying to nursing school next fall. I just wanted you to know. You didn't just save your son. You saved me too. A mother you've never met." Marla sat still for a long time. The letter trembled in her hands. She pressed it to her chest, eyes closed not to block tears, but to hold the feeling closer. This was why she didn't leave. Why she didn't disappear when the world turned its back. Why she stitched a sanctuary from the scraps of injustice. Because sometimes healing didn't echo in applause. It whispered in paper, in the ink of strangers who dared to live another day because someone else did first. A knock at the door, soft, familiar. Eli peeked his head inside. His hair was messy, his shirt untucked, and there was a stubborn smear of marker on his cheek. "Can I come in?" he asked. Marla wiped her eyes and smiled. Always. He stepped inside, carrying his toy spaceship under one arm and a lopsided drawing in the other. "Want to see what I made?" She nodded. He climbed into her lap and unfolded the paper. It was crude, childlike, but full of color. A tall figure with brown hair and a stethoscope. A small boy with a cape. Above them clouds parted, and rays of yellow crayon sunshine burst through. He pointed. "That's you, and that's me, and that's the sun coming back." She kissed the top of his head. "I love it." He leaned back in her arms. "Mom," he asked after a while. "Yeah, baby, I'm big now." She smiled. "You are." He tilted his chin up. "When I'm bigger, like adult bigger, I'm gonna protect you, okay?" She blinked, the weight of that promise punching softly at her ribs. "You already do," she whispered. "No, like really protect. Like when the bad people try to take stuff from you. Or when people say mean things. I'll be there. I'll yell back louder." She laughed gently. "I think I've got enough of that in me already." He thought about it, then nodded solemnly. "Still, I'll help." He snuggled deeper into her chest. Outside the window, the clouds shifted. The last threads of rain evaporated from the pavement, and golden light stretched long and slow across the city. Marla stood still, holding him in her arms. She walked to the window and pulled open the curtains. Across the street, someone was planting a tree. Another was chalking a message on the sidewalk, "You are loved." The world hadn't magically become just, but it was moving, and sometimes movement was enough to begin again. Eli stirred. "The rain's gone," he mumbled. "Yeah," she said. It passed. He squinted toward the horizon. "It's sunny now." She nodded. He smiled. "Cool." They stood there in silence, mother and son, staring at a world that once tried to erase them and now bowed a little in reverence. Marla leaned her cheek against his hair, and as the light warmed their faces, she whispered, "Looks like our last storm's behind us. and this time she believed it.